Velkommen til det nest siste foredraget på Israel-konferansen 2020. Det er flott at så mange kunne komme, og det er også nydelig å se at så mange følger oss på Facebook, og så også får se dette i kommende dager og uker, både på Facebook og YouTube. Foredragsholderen nå er Samuel Solomon, som dere også nettopp har hørt om Tempelplassen og Jerusalem. Nå blir temaet hva vil presidentvalget i USA bety for Israel og Midtøsten. So, Sam, good to have you directly from Jerusalem. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. So, so you're getting 2 doses. I hope everyone got a cup of coffee and ready to start. This is going to be a little bit more intense in a different way because it does have a strong political piece to it, of course. But before that, I just want to mention my wife, who was listening in, Meryl, and who is a great booster and supporter for me. She did mention something. She said, maybe this is a little confusing. I should just point it out from the prior talk. And that is, so in 1967, we did not have access to the Temple Mount till we captured Jerusalem in that miracle of 1967. And so the question is, why did we not just immediately establish our sovereignty and also our religious sovereignty and allow the Temple Mount? And there's 2 reasons for it. One was geopolitical, but the other reason is actually religious. So the geopolitical reason is there was a big concern after we won the 6-Day War. I don't buy this, by the way. After the 6-Day War, we could have done anything we wanted. We were able to, but the perception on the part of Moshe Dayan as the Minister of Defense and others was that we would have World War III with the Muslims if we did anything with the Temple Mount. So that was the kind of the overarching geopolitical reason. But there's a religious reason. In spite of the fact that because it's the holiest and only place for the Jewish people, Jews are not allowed to step on the Temple Mount itself. Not the Temple Mount, all of it, but the areas where we believe the temple once stood. Because there's controversy, like everything in Judaism, there's always a dispute as to exactly what things were. Because we're not 100% sure where the temple was, and any part of the temple is holy, and because today we are by definition impure because we're around dead people and we don't have a way to purify ourselves, which you would need something called the red heifer, the para duma, which was a special cow. There's people, by the way, raising red heifers, red cows in Israel, which is, but anyway, because we don't have it, that could can make someone pure, therefore, and I talk pure spiritually, not pure physically, therefore, many rabbis were incredibly cautious and basically said, don't walk anywhere on the Temple Mount. Now, the reality is there are many other rabbis who dispute this and say there are many areas you can walk on the Temple Mount. We know where you cannot walk, but there's many areas you can walk, and why not have that for prayer rather than being stuck at what used to be called the Wailing Wall, because the Jews are cursed and they're going to spend their entire life wailing at the wall, okay? And obviously we're not cursed and we're not wailing and we have Jerusalem in our hands. So that religious dictum, that religious principle actually made it easier for Moshe Dayan to basically do the geopolitical thing and hand it to the Waqf. If the Jews were able to really walk all over the Temple Mount without any dispute among the rabbis, then I'm sure Moshe Dayan would have had a much more difficult time doing what he did. So he used religious reluctance for his geopolitical needs. So I hope that answers Meryl's question, and I hope that makes it more clear of why, if it's so holy, why are we not all running around there? Just many, many Orthodox Jews will not walk on it. Now, I walked everywhere I believe based on my background and I dealt with my archaeologists where it would be totally okay. So I have gone to the Temple Mount. Okay, with that, let me start up my next topic. And this I'll be switching back and forth with the presentation material. I've been asked to talk a little bit about the impact of the elections on the Middle East. And I'm going to do this kind of from a broad perspective about a little bit about the politics in the United States. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about something called the Red-Green Alliance, which is important to understand as supporters of Israel, and then how this translates to what I think will be some of the political issues that we're going to have going forward. And I just want to say by way of introduction that all this is projecting, I'm going to say, what do I know? What does anyone know? First of all, he hasn't chosen his cabinet. He hasn't chosen the most important, Biden has not chosen his most important person that's going to relate to us with the Middle East, and that's the Secretary of State. And the Secretary of State is going to drive a lot of this. Just look at how Pompeo drove so many amazing things for the Jewish state because of his pro-Israel stance as both a smart guy and also because of his Christian faith, by the way. So a combination of his Christian faith and connecting to the Jewish people and to the state of Israel, and his personal connection to the state, and he allowed many things to occur that now there's going to be an attempt, depending upon who the Secretary of State is, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So I am just mentioning this in hypothetical sense because the reality is it's all going to play out. My guess is Trump will, in the end, not make it. I voted, by the way, for Donald Trump, just to put this out there. Donald Trump will not make it. And I believe the election, to some extent, what that really means, I'm not calling it cheating, but was, in a sense, stolen. But to prove that, you would have to prove something called materiality, that it really had a big impact. It's so complicated that no Supreme Court wants to really get into the details. And the fact that he's won so many states, even by thin margins, a couple of states will have required recounts. If you have less than 0.5% difference between the two candidates, then by law, you need to recount for that state. So they'll probably do a recount, maybe a recount in Pennsylvania, a recount in Georgia, but I don't think he's going to be able to pull it off. And the smartest thing that the Democrats did was call for massive mail-in ballots. I'm not going to spend time on it, but that was a brilliant strategy. We knew it. Trump knew it. And but let's just talk about this election a little, because I think it's really important. So the first thing is the original intent of this election was to be what's called a repudiation, a complete denial of everything that was Donald Trump. That's what the Democrats were seeking. They were seeking what was called a blue wave. And in fact, if you look at the mainstream media with all their surveys where he was up 10, 15, 20%, and all these major states where Biden was going to be the top performer. If you look at what the online media did, what Twitter did in terms of shutting down things that they thought were politically not required checking. Of course, they'll allow Khomeini to get up there and talk about the destruction of the state of Israel. That's not a hate speech, but anything Trump says is hate speech. I mean, there's enormous problems with the media having a lot of control, and the media and the social media also being primarily left. And that's all over the world, but in the United States, it's especially true. We have to remember that 70 million people, or half of the Americans who voted, with maybe a difference of a few million, like 4%, 5%, voted for Trump. So all these conversations I'm now hearing, I'm being called a moron, an idiot, a racist. I am not a racist. I'm definitely not a moron. I'm horribly insulted the way the Democratic Party and the Democratic left portrays people like myself. I'm for freedom of speech. I'm for open economy. I'm for less taxes. I'm for a strong stand against Iran. Why does that make me an idiot? Okay, the truth, we all know Donald Trump had a personality that people sometimes found offensive. I found him a typical New Yorker and honest, but his policies were amazing. And for the state of Israel, especially amazing, as we'll talk about. So it was not a repudiation. In fact, the Senate will probably remain Republican. And more importantly, the Democrats lost prestige because they lost anywhere from 7 to 10 seats in Congress when they originally projected that they would gain 10 to 15 seats. So what was being rejected? a strong socialist agenda, defunding the police, oil and gas and fracking, taxes. I mean, this, and they were supporting the strongest economy that the United States had since the World War II, with lower taxes and smaller regulation. Another big thing that occurred in this election was an absolute shift among blacks and Hispanics, which is why Trump took Florida, okay? The most important shift, though, was the shift on who represents the working class of America. And this has a long-term implication between Democrats and Republicans, because the Democrats are coming out as elitists. The Republicans, who are always considered in the United States to be the elitists, are now support the working class. And if you look at a map, if you look at a typical map of the election, let me see if I can just put one up for a second. Fox election map. Let's see if I can find a picture of it. This is a slightly older one, but you can get a sense here. Let me just put this up for a moment. Okay. A bit of back and forth Zoom. How do I open this up? Here it is. I'm going to put this over here so I can share all the time. Okay. So share screen. Boom. Okay, share. So if you look at this map, this is a little earlier. This is November 7th. But you can see from here what's really going on. The coasts are primarily, he should have actually have taken a few of these. This is where probably, especially Wisconsin, there was probably some inappropriate activities. Not probably, there were. Over here, over here, over here. But if you really look, is the coasts are basically Democratic, and the center of the country is essentially Republican. This is the heartland of America, but they don't carry a lot of electoral votes. Just to give you a sense of how it's stacked against Republicans ever winning. That's what is extraordinary about what Donald was able to do. California has 55 of the 270, and New York has 30, basically, okay? So they have 80, they wake up in the morning, and they already have guaranteed 80 electoral seats of the 270. What's that, 25%? So their road that they had, if you looked at the original map, they had a lot less to deal with than the Republicans, because if you look at a lot of these states are not highly populated, so they have small amounts. The only big prize here was going to be for Philadelphia, and we thought with the turnover of Pennsylvania. But after that, they're smaller. And that's and Texas, which went to the Republicans. Texas actually is the only big state. So look at this, 55 and 29 versus 38, day one. And Texas was up to grabs in the beginning. California, New York, looks like it will never become Republican. So anyway, that's a little bit of that story. Okay, let me go back to, let me shut this off for a moment, stop screen share. Okay. So it was basically a repudiation of the progressive left of the Democratic Party, and therefore the electorate, the people that were voting, did not give, and this is the most difficult issue for the Democrats, did not give a mandate for the level of change that the Democrats are going to want to do. And the Democrats have enormous tension in them between the progressive left, and you see this also in many European countries, and what I would call the mainstream, and the progressives are it's a big competing issue in terms of the tribes and the interests. But also what's really important is during this entire election, the Middle East almost got no play. The Abrahamic Accords, what's going on with Iran, what's going on with Turkey. It was basically, there was discussions about China in terms of foreign policy, and making nice to the Europeans and the EU, okay, and becoming nice people again, okay, according to the Democrats. But the Middle East didn't really have much play. So we don't even know, other than what's in the Democratic platform, which frankly doesn't mean anything anymore. They published this stuff early on. Now, whomever's in the driver's seat gets the chance to make these decisions. Now, we have to remember another key principle, and that is that Congress has influence via budgets, But foreign policy is run by the executive branch. It's run by the president, vice president, and most important, the State Department and Secretary of State, which is a cabinet position reporting up to the president. So the executive branch has the control over what's going to happen. That's why Trump was able to do as much as he could. And that is also why we'll see in a moment how Obama was able to do all the bad stuff he was doing, because they have control over foreign policy. Now, we know that Biden represents supposedly the moderate wing of the, I say supposedly because I have no idea anymore where anyone really stands, because everyone was lying in this election, including Biden, of where they really stand on things. You know, one day he's for fracking, the next day he's against fracking, one day he's for oil and gas, next day he's against oil and gas, one day he's for this and insurance, next day he's, who knows? But at this point, no one knows for sure whether or not Biden is just a fig leaf to cover up a much more progressive agenda, which is what you hear from Cortez, and you hear that from Ilhan Omar, where they're all saying Mazel Tov. Now we can finally push the Democratic Party to do what we need to do in terms of a progressive agenda. You have to understand that Bernie Sanders wrote the main policy positions with Biden, and his positions are incredibly socialist. And socialism will not work in the United States. It's one of the reasons why he lost the Latinos, because the Latinos in America ran away from socialist countries like in Venezuela and Cuba. So that's one of the reasons why they didn't do well in the election. And so you should know that only because of strong pressure from Biden was the word occupation not put into their platform. But I know, and everyone knows, it's just below the surface and it's percolating there. Okay, so I want to actually, before we go into this, I want to give you one other kind of like broader geopolitical view. I hope this interests you. Let me go back to sharing screen. Let me, where is that? Yeah, there it is. Okay. Oh, I had it and I deleted it. That was weird. Okay. Now it's large, and now let me share. Okay, so hopefully everyone here can see the screen. There's only two slides on it. And this has to do with the what they call the Red-Green Alliance, which is something that I'm very concerned about. I want to thank Ken Abramowitz, who's a partner of mine. He's actually a supporter of Chetz, who's just written a book in this area. So he talks about the Red and Green Alliance. I think Islamist is the green, though it looks like brown there because the way he sent it to me, and the red on the left. So what you have is what he would call Western civilization. And Western civilization is absolutely under attack. The Western civilization is built on three, well, actually on two core pieces. One is secular laws, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and then on top, and that's based on a foundation of Western civilization of Christian, New and Old Testament, as well as Jewish and the Bible. So it's all based on the monotheistic religions of Judeo-Christian, and that supports the secular laws of Western civilization. The Islamists and the leftists want to bring that down. This is their target. And they've been doing this on many levels. This is not just about Israel. This is about Western society in general. It's about the United States, and it's a massive concern. And these two groups, the Islamists and the leftists, are, even though they will ultimately kill each other if they ever had control, because the Islamists hate the leftists, they're the worst. But for the purpose of bringing down Western civilization, they're open to that. And so what you have on one side are democracies, which have their own inherent weaknesses. And this is really the concern that we have. It says there, World War III, the battle between democracies and dictatorships. And on the reds, you have China and Russia on one end. We've seen some things going on with China in the last few years, so we have a better understanding. And the greens, the Muslim organizations, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on, Iran, Turkey, Qatar, which is really the Muslim Brotherhood, IS, Al-Qaeda, the Wahhabis, Saudi Arabia. And these two groups of extremists are actually almost coming full circle. Let me get out of this for a moment. They're almost coming full circle to supporting each other, even though you would think about it, it doesn't make much sense. Let me get out of that and let me go back. Because if you know, it's, they say my enemy's enemy is my friend, right? So here you have the Islamists aligning with the leftists to basically take down the big Satan and the little Satan, the big Satan being the United States and the little Satan being Israel. And you're going to see how this plays out in a moment. So I want to address some of these key issues and concerns resulting from this election. And again, like I said, I'm only reading the tea leaves because we won't know until we understand who he's going to appoint. I do believe overall that Israel and the Middle East is not going to be a top issue for Biden. And therefore, he has so many other issues, especially with Corona. But they've already stated that two things. One is they want to go back somehow into the Iranian deal. And I just heard Harris the other day, Kamala Harris, say that she wants to reinstate everything with the Palestinian Authority. And those, as you'll hear in a moment, are very bad ideas to describe it that way. And you'll see why. So let's start with how we got into this, how we got to this mess. So I want to take it back to 4 years ago. So 4 years ago, and then the 8 years before of Obama. Okay, so we're now talking what, 12 to 4 years ago when Obama was in the presidency, and who was John Biden, the vice president? You know, okay. So what happened? He bookended. Think about this. The new president of the United States. We just came out of 2008 of the worst crashes, worst financial crisis of the United States in dozens of years. And the first place he goes to visit when he leaves the United States is where? You remember where he went? Went to Cairo, right? He went to Cairo to give a speech. He basically he invited all the Muslim Brotherhood people he knew. He disinvited people that were from the traditional Sunni world in Egypt. And he basically went there and he told, firstly, he said something that was completely disgusting, that the reason for and he apologized for it later, but this is how the Democrats think, that the reason for Israel was an answer to the Holocaust, completely ignoring thousands of years of Jewish history and our indigenous connection to the state of Israel. And as I told you in my last lecture, Jerusalem has only been the capital of one country, and that capital was only for the state of Israel. So he said two things. One is he wanted to put sunlight between Israel and the United States. Sorry, three things. So what did he do? He started off with his first visit to Cairo, and 8 years later, what was the last thing he did? Was 2334 of the Security Council, which I'll talk about in a moment. So he had three big Middle Eastern strategic agendas. One was to separate, he called it put sunlight between Israel and the United States. So instead of us being real partners and allies, he wanted to basically make sure that the United States, that Israel knew who the real boss was. It was condescending. It was a powerful attack on Israel and on Bibi and our independence and our sovereignty. And that's what we suffered with for 8 years. He basically, the second thing he wanted to do was to invest in and encourage the Muslim Brotherhood. This is unbelievable, as a counterweight to the other regional powers. He actually saw that the Muslim Brotherhood could be a moderating element inside the Middle East, which was a complete misreading of everything going on in the Middle East. The Saudis told him this, the Kuwaitis told him this, everyone told him this, the Israelis told him this. He didn't want to hear from it. He was going to empower them. And that's part of the reason why the Saudis stepped back. That, by the way, along with the third element, is why the unintended consequence was the Abraham Accords, was the shifting of a lot of alignment to the state of Israel by the Sunni countries that saw the United States was no longer a dependable ally, and they needed to do more regionally. And they also wanted to have a connection to the United States through Israel. and therefore the alignment with Israel. So that's why you're seeing a lot of these pushing within the Abrahamic Accords. The third was he wanted to do a deal with Iran. That was going to be his signature deal. And as we all know, the Iran deal was not really a deal. It was an understanding. It was never ratified. It's not really signed. There's a million, and it only stops it for a few years. Worst deal in the world. As you know, Bibi had to speak before Congress to try to, and I agree with him, it was his finest moment. He had to. He was not interfering in politics. Had he not done that and Iran had gotten the bomb, then everyone would have said, what do you mean? You didn't stand up for your own rights. He had to go before Congress. But that basically was the icing on the cake for the breakup in the relationships between Israel and the United States during that period of time. That led to ultimately the Security Council 2334, which was passed in December. Actually, it was passed after he already lost the election. You should know that Donald Trump tried to stop this and couldn't, which, you think about it, they're complaining about Trump putting in a new Supreme Court justice just before the change in election. Meanwhile, he did this after the election, when he was already a lame duck president. And that Security Council 2334 that talks about the illegal occupation of settlements, which is neither illegal nor an occupation. And you may have even heard some lectures about it, so I'm not going to talk about it. But I saw you had someone who's an expert in this area of this. It weaponized all this Security Council 2334 weaponized many different international bodies to attack Israel, primarily the Human Rights Council, that then after that released their boycott list, which is completely illegal, one-off illegal at every level. It also allowed the ICC, it gave permission to the ICC, another UN-type body, to go after Israel. UNESCO, UNRWA. I mean, it basically empowered the anti-Israel side, and that was the gift that Obama. Now, what exactly Biden's role in that? No one really knows. We do know one thing, that since he had the Ukrainian portfolio, which will be the undoing of Biden because of his son, but because he had the Ukrainian, we know that he did call and put pressure on the Ukrainians to vote. They had a rotating seat in the Security Council to vote for this resolution. And don't believe a thing the US says, oh, we abstained. We were doing favors for them. Now, this thing got really, really bad when it came to certain interactions, such as this. There's a place called Ramat Shlomo. Let me share the screen again. I'll show you this thing. Share screen. This is my most powerful photo. I don't know if you can see it. These are 4 Holocaust survivors, all of them with the numbers of Auschwitz. There's someone did photos of the final surviving members from the Holocaust. This is my screensaver to always remind me, what can happen if we don't pay attention. So Ramat Shlomo. So here's a Google Maps. I did this lookup just before we started. So here is what's called, this is main Jerusalem. Here is Shmuel HaNavi is right in the middle of Jerusalem. This is Meir Sharim, Kamunah, all Jerusalem, Highway 1. Here is Ramat Eshkol. This, by the way, was the armistice line from 1948. And there was nothing built anywhere here. And Greater Jerusalem was created, and they had an announcement of building starts of building in the licensing committee in Jerusalem that was going to start in Ramat Shlomo. And let me go back. I can stop the sharing again. Let me put this down for a second. Let me go back to my notes. Okay. So there was a tender process. Israel's very bureaucratic when it comes to land. Just trust me, it took me 3 years just to get a permit to build my house here. It's crazy. And now I have to redo the permit. So I think they were in like stage 3 of a 17-stage process. The announcement of the stage was done. I don't think anyone even thought that it had anything to do with anything. At that moment, Biden was in Israel. Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State. And basically, Hillary she talks about it on a 45-minute insulting rampage phone call against Bibi. Biden refused to meet Bibi and went on strike while he was here in Israel. And they were all doing the bidding of Obama using this. This was, by the way, the Ramat Shlomo building tender was picked up by left-wing Israeli groups and used to drive a wedge. So we have our own issues too, to drive a wedge between Israel and the United States. So this was all going on during the Obama administration with Biden as the vice president. Now, he then gave a famous Friends speech, Kerry, just before he left. Let me share this. You'll tell me, Conrad, if the audio works for this thing. Let me share this. You'll tell me if the audio works for this.
Believe that the U.S. friendship means the U.S. must accept any policy, regardless of our own interests.
Can you hear that? Good. Just listen to this. It's just a small piece. This guy, they say, you'll call in English a Mamzer Gummer. He is what I call the benign face of anti-Semitism. You'll never see it as that. He is actually, within the IRA, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, he is an anti-Semite. Because he only singles out Israel for this. I'd like to see him give the same speech about Turkey and Cyprus. He never would. So here's what he says. Start it from the beginning.
Some seem to believe that the U.S. friendship means the U.S. must accept any policy, regardless of our own interests, our own positions, our own words, our own principles, even after urging again and again that the policy must change. Friends need to tell each other the hard truths, and friendships require mutual respect. Israel's permanent representative to the United Nations, who does not support a two-state solution, said after the vote last week.
So I'm going to stop that. So him talking about, notice the religion of the two-state solution. It's a religion. It's presented as the only solution, which is completely hogwash. But you can hear him using this mantra as well as, we're not friends. We're strong allies. Very different. The entire model of the Democrats is friends have to tell other friends, and you need to know the truth, and you can't handle the truth. You meaning Israel.
It's to be expected that Israel's greatest ally would act in accordance with the values that we share and veto this resolution. I am compelled to respond today that the United States did, in fact, vote in accordance with our values, just as previous U.S. administrations have done at the Security Council before.
That's a complete lie. I don't want to do any more. They've always defended Israel as their ally, just like Russia defends their Iran. They've always vetoed any resolution like this. He's a complete and utter liar. This is the face of the Democratic Party, and this is my biggest concern. And you're looking at the Secretary of State here, and this is really, you'll see in a moment, my biggest concern when it comes to this. Let me go off stop share again and go back to my notes. So the word. So that type of issue around friends and we're friends, but we have to really send is basically we're going to send you a message, and we're angry. You also see that he subtly attacked Bibi because, you know something, you don't have our shared values. It's disgusting. Okay, but anyway, let's continue. So how much have the goalposts really been moved? Because what happened since Obama has left office is a series of very important things. And the question is whether or not the genie can be put back in the bottle, and how much the Democrats really should put the genie back in the bottle, because they can finally turn Israel, they can finally use, let me step back. They don't have to put the genie back in the bottle. In other words, to remove Jerusalem, the Golan, and all the other things I'll talk about in a moment, because the reality is they can blame it on the Trump administration, basically. And they can make the Trump administration the bad guys. And this has a lot to do with who the Secretary of State is going to be. So what are some of the things that Donald Trump did with the administration? We all know about Jerusalem, the Golan, the things going on in the Human Rights Council, then leaving the Human Rights Council, leaving UNESCO, defunding UNRWA, which is a complete and utter corrupt organization. The Pompeo Doctrine, which basically said that the lands in Judea and Samaria are not an illegal occupation, but rather dispute, and that Israel has real, legitimate, historic, and legal rights to Judea and Samaria. Think about this. This is something that's very domestic. I don't think most of my friends here in Norway would know this. He implemented something called a Title VI action under IRA. Again, IRA is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. It's the way to define anti-Semitism, and also what aspects of anti-Semitism is really based on saying something that's anti-Zionism. So, for example, claiming that this Jewish state is a Nazi-like state, that is an expression of anti-Semitism. Saying something that Israel is guilty of and never pointing out any other country, in other words, only singling out Israel, that is a form of anti-Semitism. They have specific examples. You can look it up. It's on the website. Again, it's called the International Remembrance Holocaust Alliance, and it's well worth reading through the examples, my friends in the room. Okay? So he implemented saying that if right now the situation in the campuses are horrible in the United States, to get federal funding, you use something called a Title VI. So he said that what Trump did is say that if you violate the IRA definitions by making Jewish students uncomfortable due to attack of Israel, like Israel Apartheid Week and all these things that they do, that university can be sued under Title VI to get rid of their federal funding, which is like death for most of these schools. And so he implemented that. In fact, it's the first worldwide implementation of a legal framework to litigate under IRA. It was done by Donald Trump. Here's a small thing just happened 2 weeks ago. And again, it comes right out of the State Department. It has nothing to do with Congress. That people, Jews born in Jerusalem, forget of Western Jerusalem, which no one says we're leaving Western Jerusalem. Up to now, they would not put Jerusalem as the birthplace on their passports. I don't know if you knew that. That was considered to be verboten. Now you can have Jerusalem on your passports, okay, as a U.S. citizen born in Jerusalem. But the most impressive, as we all know, are the Abrahamic Accords with the UAE and Bahrain and now Sudan. And I want to just remind you what Kerry said in this regard. I want you to remember he gave a long speech as part of that speech that you just saw, and I'm going to bring this quote. I won't even play the video. He said, quote, "There will be no advanced and separate peace with the Arab world without the Palestinian process and Palestinian peace. Everybody needs to understand that. This is the hard reality." In other words, Kerry was wrong. The Secretary of State had a worldview of Weltanschauung that was completely off, because what does the UAE and the Abrahamic Accords and all these new overtures with Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries? It shows that basically the Arab countries want to separate the Palestinian process from general work in the neighborhood. Now, that's being driven by two big realities. One is, like I told you, they don't any longer trust the United States as to be there for them. And the second is Iran. Both those realities have shifted everything. And Bibi and Donald Trump and the Donald Trump administration understood that and drove that. And so where this is going to go, I'm not sure yet. And we'll talk about that at the end of my last few minutes before I turn it over for questions. But this was what Israel was facing as a reality from a Secretary of State just before the policy was handed over to Trump. One was Security Council 2334, which was a disaster for us and a complete violation of the relationship between Israel and the United States as allies. And then the second was this Abrahamic Accords that they were actually I'll tell you something worse. We know for a fact that the Obama administration were telling the Palestinians as well as the Arabs around, don't do a deal with Israel until we get the PA involved. They were actually interfering in our negotiation political process. It's unbelievable because they have, when I say they, the Democrats, the left-wing side of the Democratic Party, which was in control, not progressive yet, just left-wing, Obama and Kerry and others. We don't know where Biden was in this, but I don't know about Biden. I don't even know how much cognizant. I don't know if he's just a paper tiger and everything's going to be from behind him. But they basically were pushing down our throats a Palestinian two-state solution. Now, I don't have time to talk about two states today and what that really means. But two states, if it's meant in the real sense of a state, would be complete suicide for the state of Israel. Because the first time, because there will be terror. There's no way there's not going to be terror. The first time there's an attack on civilians in Israel, and Israel tries to go in and stop it because let's just assume they don't have arms. They're disarmed, the Palestinians. But the first time the Israelis go in there, that's invading now a sovereign country. That's invading another country. How are they going to do that? The UN will immediately shut down Israel on it, claiming that we invaded and now we're invaders. So two-state is a very problematic issue for us, especially knowing full well that in the Arab world, there are no democracies, none, zero at all. I'm trying to think of one. If you can find one, let me know. People used to like to quote Lebanon. And Israel needs to stand firm on what its principles are. But the left and the hard left in the United States believes in this what I call progressive pro-EU agenda. And what is that? Reliance on international organizations such as the UN and consensus and alliances. And America, according to that world, needs to be constrained, and Israel, as a regional power, needs to be constrained. Now, I wrote an article about this that Conrad, if you're interested, can send it around. Let me just put this up on the screen for a moment. Where is my, here it is. Give me a moment. Yeah, there it is. Let me share this screen. Okay. So a lot of this stuff I've written, I have a website. If you're ever interested in getting any information or being in contact with me, this is my website, sam-solomon.com, sam-solomon.com. And I have a whole series of articles down here, okay, that you can find. One of the articles is this one, which is it's not a long read. It's called America, International Institutions and the Strategy of the Weak. And this is based on this fellow by the name of Robert Kagan, who wrote a book on this area based on during the Cold War. Let me see if I can find his book for a moment.
Sam, can you hear me?
Excuse me?
Your screen is not shared.
My screen is not. Oh, I didn't press share. Sorry. You're right. Yeah, so now it's shared. So this is the website, sam-solomon.com. My articles are down here, okay? And one of these articles is based on a book that is phenomenal called Of Paradise and Power. I have a copy of it if anyone wants. I had it scanned. This book basically goes through and explains how, why, and how European countries, because of, frankly, all the things that happened from World War I and World War II, and how inherently weak and the lack of ability of European powers today to project power, their entire strategy is to internationalize every conflict, this is the book if you want to get it, is to internationalize every conflict and to make it and to restrain the dominant global power, which is the United States. And if you look at the actions of the EU, you'll see that that is very much what they're doing. And I wrote an article here, which I'm showing on the screen, on my website called America, International Institutions and the Strategy in the Weak. and I write about it in detail about how this works. It's not a long article. It was published in American Thinker. So let me just, now I'll stop sharing again. Let me go back to my notes. So so that we need to be constrained. That has been the operative way that the Democratic Party, as it shifted more and more to the left and more progressive, was to basically say that the key is internationalization of everything. Everything is negotiated. Iran, negotiate, no matter what it is. Oh, crappy deal, who cares? Do it anyway, because it's better to have regional alignment, okay, between the United States and Europe than to actually constrain a major power that is the #1 funder of state terrorism, trying to build nuclear weapons, destabilizing, murdering Americans, Europeans, trying to commit terror acts on European soil. No. We, peace in our own time. Chamberlain, we can negotiate with them. That is the EU is built on that as a premise. And the progressive and left side of the United States has that same thing. And they are a gravitational force now, the left and progressive agenda in the Democratic Party. Okay. Now, if you add to that what I said to you earlier, the national naivete of the Americans, and frankly the Europeans too, because I listen to what they say, it blows me away, about Middle Eastern relations and politics and people. I mean, they don't even understand how tribalism works in the Middle East. When they look at Syria, they don't understand that the decomposition of Syria was along tribal lines. It's all tribe, and tribe is family, by the way, okay? And they believe you can fix everything through democracy, which they believe means elections, which is ridiculous. It's democracy is not about elections. That's the end result. It's about institutions of freedom. It's about a free and unfettered press. It's, when Turkey has the most number of journalists in prison anywhere in the world, we know we have a problem. We have a real problem with Muslim and Arab countries. And the only unfettered press, which is how you can have people write really bad things about Israel inside Israel, is Israel, because we have an unfettered press and a very aggressive press, okay? And the ability to protest. And people aren't shot in the street for this, okay? It's, there's every single Saturday night, there's been protests against Bibi. That's part of the democratic process, okay? That's what we have. We're a real democratic state. And so what we see here is the attempt on the part of the progressive and left part of the Democratic Party to pull the Democratic Party to the left, where basically it's aligning with what are really the enemies of Israel, okay? They believe that the Palestinians are the aggrieved party. Even though they mouth support for Israel for security, they don't believe that the Palestinians have agency because they're victims. It's all Israel's problem, okay? They don't read and understand Arabic. They don't know what they say to each other. They have no idea how anti-Semitic, not just about inciting violence against Israel and Israelis and civilians, but literally anti-Semitic. The head, I'm not going to play this video, but it was presented at another conference of yours by Palestinian Media Watch, where the head of the religious organization of the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah talked about how the reason why the world screwed up is because of the rabbis. That's anti-Semitism. That's not even incitement. And there's lots of things like that. It's said all the time. It's disgusting. And the fact that the European Union does not call out anti-Semitism for what it is and sees it all as some political debate is part of the complete lack of understanding of how serious our issue is here. Okay, I mentioned already about the two-state mantra and why that's really an issue. The other mantra that the left has in that we're now going to see with Obama, with Biden, is that if you solve the Israeli-Palestinian, well, first of all, that everything flows through the PA, through the Palestinian Authority. Now we see that's not true with these peace deals, but they're going to still push for that. But that's been discredited a lot. But the other thing is, if you solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it'll bring total peace to the region, which we know is false. Okay, with all that as a basis, understanding where we're standing, let me just conclude with a couple of thoughts, and then I have about 6 minutes for questions. The first is, the big question is who's going to be the Secretary of State? That is critical, because without that, there's no way to understand what's going to be Biden's agenda. So it's a pretty broad brush. It's all the way from Susan Rice, who would be a real problem for us. I hope she doesn't get it because of her sins of Benghazi and what she repeatedly lied about Benghazi, got caught on it. She claims now, I don't know who she tries to blame. There's also, but here's another example. Chris Coons, who is the Democrat from Delaware, a senator, he's being considered. So he just wrote an article a few weeks ago in Foreign Policy magazine, the #1 magazine for foreign policy. I read the article this morning and I just couldn't believe it. So I then cut and pasted it into Word so I could do a word search. I was looking for the word Israel. Believe it or not, this guy spends 5 pages talking about foreign policy in the middle and everything going on in China, Russia, Middle East, never mentions the state of Israel. Not even as an ally, not even Israel kind of, it happens to be in the same neighborhood. That tells me there's a problem with him. There's a guy, Anthony Blinken, is being considered, Chris Murphy, whatever it is, that person, that Secretary of State is going to be the biggest indicator of how much of a problem we have vis-a-vis Israel with Iran. The second big thing we all have to consider is Iran. If there's anything you should be talking to your representatives in Norway about, is Iran is an issue not just for Israel, not just for the United States, for all Western democracies, okay? And where Iran goes, so goes Lebanon, Syria, the Gaza Strip, and many other places. Now, the second piece of that is, remember the Red Green Alliance, is Turkey. Turkey is serious. They're the Muslim Brotherhood. It's interesting that Turkey and Iran are aligning themselves, by the way, with China, both involved with Iran, seriously with Iran, and now with Turkey. It's crazy. That's the Red Green Alliance right there. You see it. And Turkey is basically trying to run the whole Muslim Brotherhood and reestablish the caliphate of the Ottoman Empire. Now, they won't pull it off because the Arabs hate them. As you know, the Turks are not Arabs. Neither are the Iranians, by the way. Neither of them are the Turkoman and the Persian Arabs. Neither one of them are and the Iranians, neither one of them are Arabs. They're Muslims, but not Arabs. And the Arabs hated the Ottoman Empire because the Ottoman Empire suppressed the Arabs. I mean, when Erdogan went to Egypt and said, "Look, we want to come back and be your friends," they hate him. This is actually before Sisi took over. This is when the Muslim Brotherhood took over. He thought he was saying something nice to the Muslim Brotherhood because they were running it. It was the opposite. They said, "We don't want the Turks in Egypt. We're an independent empire. Get out of here." And he was roundly rejected. So even though they're polar opposites, Turkey supporting the Muslim Brotherhood and Iran is supporting Shiite terrorism, and Turkey supporting Muslim Brotherhood terrorism and ISIS, it happens to be that they link together on one issue, hatred of Israel. It's extraordinary. Now, the finally is what's going to happen with the PA? Does the U.S. re-engage in the PA with 2 states? What's it mean to be a state? Do all roads have to lead through Ramallah or not? Okay, because obviously Bibi and Trump felt it didn't have to. So this is really where I want to just spend one more moment before I give you my 1 or 2 minutes of recommendation. I just want to point this book. I'm going to share the screen again. Share. Oh no, it's on the screen. That's right. That's right. I'm holding it up. I don't share. I put this back and put this up. Okay. Can you see this book? This is a great book to read. It's called A Strong Horse by Les Smith. Okay. Critical book to read. Why is this book critical? Because it explains the sociology of how the Arab world works. And the Arab world works under the concept of strength. If you show strength, you're respected. It has to do, by the way, with the way their tribes are set up. They give all the power to the tribal chief. In return for that, the tribal chief is supposed to protect them. And the strong horse in the Middle East, compromise and accommodation is not only creates disrespect, it actually violates the way the Arabs here in the Middle East work. You have to be strong. And this is really a big problem. So what are my recommendations? I am hoping that the Biden administration will take advantage of what Trump has done, that they can let him be the bad guy, and they very cautiously do anything towards the PA and Iran. And in both cases, they should exact very high prices to re-engage. If Kamala Harris is really telling us the truth, that she wants to immediately open up the PA mission back in Washington, D.C., which is maybe against the law, they may not be able to, as well as give back funding to the criminal enterprise called UNRWA, as well as to reestablish all the funding back to the Palestinian Authority, which also they can't do because there's something called the Taylor Force Act, which reduces the money by the amount that they pay terror families for killing Jews. So if they don't do something to create a price for that, and they just re-engage, that will violate totally the strong horse principle. This is the biggest mistake the Biden administration would do with the Secretary of State if they're going to read it. And so that's and the same thing with the Iranians. Sanctions have to remain, and they have to stay in place, and they have to negotiate strongly, including their terror activities, which was completely left out of the initial deal. Lastly, the Abraham Accords. Strong horse created Abraham Accords. Weak horse will reduce the effectiveness of the Abraham Accords. And that's the other piece that's very important. The part I'm not going to talk about today, and I'm going to leave it with this, but I know it's the other topic, is what's going to happen between Israeli and American Jews in terms of the rift. Because I'm not so sure you know this, but about 80% of American Jews voted for Biden, and about 80% or 80% of Israeli Jews voted for Trump. Okay? Obviously, it's not because of American politics. We voted that way because what we perceive as who's a better friend to Israel, right? All politics is local. So that type of divide, which is along cultural, religious, a million different factors. Okay, you should know that Israel, among American Jews, only represented an important issue, a top issue, among 3% of American Jews. So we have a problem there, but that's for a different time. With that, I have time for about 5 minutes of questions, Conrad, if you have some.
Thanks. You hear me? In fact, make it. Here we go. So, in fact, you answered partly one of the questions: why so many American Jews in America support the Democratic ticket and vote against the pro-Israel Trump. Yep.
I didn't answer it. The real answer is that I'll give you a couple of statistics. So one was 3%, right? The more important statistic is less than 50% of American Jews today see their identification with Jews and Israel as an identification, as a tribal identification, don't see it anymore. So less than 50% of American Jews today do not have a feeling of connection to their Judaism. Forget about the state of Israel, to their Judaism. And the outside of the Orthodox and traditional, which is only maybe 10, 15% of the population, the other 80, 85% of the population are progressive liberals. It's kind of built into their whole view. It got then enhanced during World War II with Roosevelt, where they felt that Roosevelt was the friend of the Jews, not knowing that actually Roosevelt was not only an anti-Semite, but actually was directly involved by not bombing the various concentration camps and other activities he did in the murder of many Jews. And there's now books out on this finally because they've declassified all the material. Okay, so but the Jews have been supporters of the Democratic Party, just like blacks and Hispanics, almost like lemons marching down for the last since World War II. And breaking this is very difficult now because, at least for America, not like with Hispanics who are Catholic and conservative, Jews are irreligious and non-identifying and liberal. So that's the real reason for the difference.
Yeah. So the other question. So in Norway, there was a strong pro-Israel community in the left wing among the Social Democrats in the first decades after the Second World War. And do you think that history could repeat itself, and that you can see a much stronger support for Israel coming from the left?
That's a great question, because it's discussed a lot. I don't believe so, and the reason is that boat has left. That ship has left the harbor. What do I mean by that? Is that the Israel was essentially a socialist country in the first 15, 20 years. By the way, we were going bankrupt as a socialist country. And one of the greatest things that Bibi did before he became prime minister, he was the finance minister, and he basically unshackled and created a more capitalist-oriented competitive environment in Israel. And through that, that's why our economy went crazy and startup nation and so forth. And so with that, we basically left the socialist world behind. And by the way, mostly even the socialist principles in Sweden and Norway, especially in Scandinavian countries, they're not. I've heard a number of very interesting lectures. Are they really socialist today? And the answer is they're not. They're more like Israel. There's a desire for social values and support, but it's not socialism. And because of that, we cannot use that approach. And actually, it's not something I think that not only can we not go back to it, it would be dysfunctional for Israel to go back to it, and the Europeans won't handle it anyway. The issue with the Europeans today is the internationalization of the conflict. I strongly recommend you read that article as part of your pro-Israel support, the article I wrote on internationalization, because that internationalization is now weaving its way through the ICC and UNESCO and the General Assembly. It has created this very dysfunctional view that Israel is by its very nature a problem. That's really what it is. And Israel has to be diminished in power, similar to the United States, because we're too strong a force, and they can't control us this way. And it's very, and you can definitely never do anything unilateral. Oh my God! God forbid you ever. The only time you can do something unilateral when it's in your backyard. So it was okay for during the whole Serbia thing and everything, when the EU moved in and did the bombing with Bosnia. There, they did that unilaterally, by the way. But God forbid any other country, why? Because it was in their backyard. But God forbid Israel should do something unilateral, whether it has to do with Iran, whether it has to do with the Palestinian Authority, whether it has to do with Judea and Samaria, whether it has to do with Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Nothing can be unilateral. So it's all about tying our hands, controlling us, and there's no room there anymore for a realignment based on the principles between socialist countries. Oh, that was the other thing I wanted to tell you. One of the things Obama said, because he is a classic European socialist, was he pines for the days. He remembers the wonderful days. He's not the only one who said this, of when Golda Meir was running the country. Now, what's he mean by that? He means because that back then it was a socialist country that he remembers those golden days. It wasn't that golden, and lots of issues there. But he likes to describe that as the golden period of Israel, and that today we're too right wing and anti-freedom and all that stuff. And so it's not only did the European socialists feel that way, even the American socialists inside the Democratic Party, like Obama, also felt that way.
Yeah.
The other questions?
There's another question regarding Kamala Harris, but I think you mentioned her. We don't use more time. But there are two questions regarding your first talk. The archaeology you have presented confirms biblical history from the time going back to King David. Do archaeology confirm biblical history further back? Any persons, events? Very briefly, if you can.
Just restate your question one more time. What is?
Does archaeology confirm biblical history before the time of King David?
Yeah, so this is actually the big, it's a big internal debate among archaeologists in Israel, and it's as well as, of course, related to outside, but in Israel it's a big thing. I can't go through the whole thing. You should just know there's a big debate on whether or not the Bible is a roadmap to biblical archaeology, or whether it's just purely coincidental. So there's this, and that reality is that King David really ran a little like village. He wasn't really a king of an empire. And what was before, the Jews basically were really Canaanites, sea people, and didn't come from Egypt. That's all a myth. So there's kind of this fundamental debate. I believe that in general, the biblical archaeologists that believe that the Bible is a roadmap to understanding archaeology in Israel, and it validates it, is the winning hand. But they're still strong, especially this Professor Finkelstein. I took those quotes out. I actually had some quotes from these guys talking about it, because they really are the ones against this whole temple sifting project, because it's, and that's why they're saying, oh, you didn't do it through layers, because they don't like finding out that there's a seal from the head of the treasury from Jeremiah from that time on the Temple Mount, because the Temple Mount was just some little minor tribal thing, and it wasn't a universal prayer area. But there is archaeology that goes way back, all the way back. I'll just tell you one example: Chatzor. So I used to live with Meryl, and I lived in Chatzor. It's up in the north, right near Kiryat Shmona by Rosh Pina. And Chatzor, that was one of the major palace defending tells or areas, because it was the highest hill that guarded what's called the King's Highway, which came from Babylonia down to Egypt. There was two highways that basically controlled all the traffic from Babylonia in Lebanon to Egypt, and they both went through Israel. That's why Israel was constantly in battle. Okay, and this Chatzor has a burn line exactly where it's described time-wise through carbon dating of when King Solomon destroyed the Chatzor palace. Okay, so that's an example of that's King Solomon. So that's that's really early stuff. And there's obviously the problem with archaeological evidence to the time, let's say, of Abraham, is it would have all been, for the most part, fallen apart. If it was wood or straw or mats, that doesn't exist anymore. So it'll only be buildings, and from that you would actually have to look at the pottery. Usually the pottery is what they use, and there's pottery that predates. Yes.
Yeah.
What was the second question?
Last question. Dear Sam, thank you for your most interesting lecture on Jewish history in Jerusalem. Do you think it is due to anti-Semitism that Western politicians deny the overwhelming historical facts, or is it fear of Muslim Arab reprisals?
Ask that question one more time.
Do they deny the historical facts and the Jewish connection to the country because of anti-Semitism, or do they fear Arab?
Right. Oh, they fear Arab condemnation. I get it. I actually think they work together. The problem is, it's to call it specifically. Actually, what I believe it is that it's important for Western leaders to not emphasize Jewish indigenous rights here, because first of all, almost every country is invaded. By the way, how many indigenous people are in Norway, England? I haven't met many Anglo-Saxons or Vikings lately. France. None of those countries are indigenous. They've all been invaded and turned over. How many peoples, how many Vikings have come back with their language, which could have been dead, Hebrew in their case, whatever their language was, and come back to their land and say, look, you know something? We really like this area in London. This is, we were there, we built it. Look, these are our houses. This is where we were 2,500 years ago. They don't exist. The only people that have come back to their ancestral home has been the Jewish people with their language and everything else. And we are indigenous by every definition of the UN. By the way, the UN has a definition of indigenousness, which is us and not the Palestinians. Do you know what the UN did? They took the indigenous definition off their freaking website. That's what they did. Now, so is that fear? No, it is I think it's more of a political statement but it's built inside an anti-Semitic worldview that basically says that we can't give the Jews anything that will afterwards enhance their period. You also have to understand that in the Christian world, outside of the Christians that are highly supportive of Israel, the general Christian world still engages in a replacement theology, which is that when the Jews were thrown out of Israel and we did not accept Jesus, we were now judged as condemned and replaced, and we're no longer relevant. So Israel's reemergence, Christianity has gone through a major re-examination since the state of Israel was created, because according to classic Christian theology, it should never have happened. And so there is something of an element, I'm sorry to say, not necessarily of Muslim attack, but more of a classic replacement theology, anti-Semitism within the classic Western world, similar to what we've seen with other aspects of how they want to deal with Christianity versus Judaism. There's 600 million, for example, evangelical Christians in the world, between 600 to 800 million. Not every one of them believes that the Jewish people have a right here. The vast majority still believe that there's a replacement theology, or we're here just for the end of days. So I work very closely with our Christian friends, both in Israel and outside. Conrad knows a lot about it. And it's not everyone that holds that way. And replacement theology is an inherent. By the way, Islam is by definition replacement theology. But they're less an issue for us in terms of, because our interactions with Islam were not as fraught with violence. There was a lot of it, but not compared to what happened in Western Europe over the last 1,000 years. So I would say it's much more, and I hope I don't offend anyone, coming out of more of a Christian view of replacement theology than necessarily anything to do with the Muslim world.
So with that, we are 12 minutes behind schedule, and thanks a lot, Sam, for joining us. And Litraot. All the best.
Thank you, regards. And if any of you ever come visit Israel, please look me up. I'd love to get together with you and come visit with us, and to add you to our growing list of friends in support of the state of Israel and the people of Israel. And God bless all the work that you do and all the things that you do for the state of Israel. It does not go unappreciated. It means an enormous amount to all of us, and we thank you for that from the bottom of our hearts.
Thank you.